Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I am here with my friend Hank, but this is not part of our Church Fathers series. This is really actually more of an interview of Hank. Hank reached out to me. He's been reading Pope Benedict's writings on liturgy, and he really wanted to have a chance to share some of his thoughts and learnings from that reading. And so this is going to be mostly an interview of Hank. I'm sure I'll have some thoughts as we go along. But when we get started, I mean, Hank, you've spilled some of your biography a little bit in our church series. But in case anyone's coming to this video alone or hasn't watched all of our Church Fathers series, do you want to give at least a little bit of background on yourself and how you came to be interested in the subject?
Sure. Well, I became a Christian probably, in the 70s through a variant of the Japuza movement, which is Jesus People USA. And that was a highly evangelical, very much the altar call, very much the baptism. And immediately, because of my interest in reading, first person I grabbed and read all his books was C.S. Lewis. And I became sort of where Sam, you're a biblical Unitarian and had your own problems with the church. I had my own problems with the church because I started asking questions like, I'm reading the first 3 chapters of Genesis and this doesn't make sense as a story. Really? It was 6 days because there's light and then there's sun and there's this and there's that. And I was sort of told, you know what, sit down, be quiet. Don't ask these questions. So I just sort of set it aside for years. And as time went on, I just found that I was not very well satisfied with the evangelical church writ large.
We'll talk a little bit about your experience in Willow Creek.
Well, I mean, Willow Creek was really a Japuza on steroids. It was all about getting people in the seats and getting them to become Christians, right? And it was happening when the mainline church had finally disintegrated. The Catholic Church was in a clown show period, and the what we would call the traditional evangelical churches were cloistered. They were in their small communities.
And there was lots of baby boomers moving to the suburbs and having kids.
And the suburbs were not great communities. Okay. Mm-hmm. You know, my dad explained growing up in Chicago that you had a community and you did all these things for people. You bowled, you went to shows, you did everything. There's your community. The suburbs, it was much harder to have a community. And it was very sterile, and it was the brutalist 70s architecture. I would love to show people the 70s, when I went in the late 70s to College of DuPage, which is in DuPage County. It looked pretty bad. And so you had this sterile environment where kids were growing up through their greatest generation parents, and the church was unable to work with us. Kids thought this was lame. And Bill Hybels created something that wasn't lame, and people just flocked to it like crazy. So I will always say this, they were very good at getting people in the door, very good at getting people to make an assent of faith, not very good at teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just not very good. And really bad with people who were, because one of the things we find with this little corner of the internet is you have people who are all over the place. And the problem in Jonathan Pageau talks about multiplicity and unity. The problem is that the churches back then didn't like multiplicity too much, but they really loved unity. So it became a place for a lot of people. So I after a while, got married and headed off to High Church Anglicanism. Kate, my lovely wife, we then moved to a Bible church. And then finally, the last 4 years have been Catholics. And funny thing is, we both believe the Lord led us here, because I was satisfied intellectually and my wife was satisfied mystically. Usually you have a lot of stories where people enter the Catholic Church where it's one member of the couple that's sort of pushing the process, and the other couple member saying, I'm not so sure. Okay. Both of us were like, yeah, this is where we want to be. We both feel that was the leading of the Holy Spirit. So at that time, I started reading early church fathers. That's when I reached out to you and said, Sam, I'm learning some things that are freaking me out. And you had already had a relationship with the early church fathers, because you were reading them to basically buttress your biblical Unitarianism.
That's not quite fair. I was trying to figure out where this idea of the Trinity came from. And I was sort of convinced that, well, all these Trinitarians I see now have such terrible arguments that presumably there must have been someone in the past who was better at explaining and arguing for this thing than the people I'm running into now. That was really why I started reading the early church fathers.
Well, it's still about your biblical Unitarianism. It's just,
well, I mean, I was exploring Trinitarianism. I wanted to make sure I wasn't wrong. Right. I wasn't trying to defend. I honestly didn't know ahead of time going into that exercise that it would buttress my biblical Unitarianism. I just wanted to learn what the early church fathers thought.
Right. And so we've had this conversation for a few years now. My favorite still being Origen, because I think it's funny. We'll talk about Pope Benedict in a few moments. He liked to quote Origen.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Okay. And so I think that what it has is deepened my appreciation for obviously I kid around with people, the Apostolic Church, the Catholic Church. It's deepened my appreciation because the Catholic Church hasn't severed itself from the history of the Church, where I think a lot of times the conversations we have and listening to other people who are very well-meaning and very intelligent is they have cut themselves off. And sometimes the conversations that they have, it's like, yeah, it's sort of limited. You're not getting it all. You're not seeing it all. Obviously, if I ran a seminary, whether it was Catholic or Protestant, I think that teaching of the early church fathers would have to be foundational. Mm-hmm. You can't understand our faith without it, because we actually live it. We actually refer to it without even knowing it. And so what interests me was I read Pope Benedict's book a few years back, Introduction to Christianity. I'm like, wow, this thing's a mind blower. And then I read all his writings on liturgy. I'm like, his idea of worship, I think, would be very interesting both for Catholics and Protestants to understand. He sees it a little differently than a lot of us do.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Benedict's career and biography. We know that he was the most recent pope, but how did he get there, and how did he become the sort of thinker he was?
Okay. So Pope Benedict was born Joseph Ratzinger in April 16, 1927, Holy Saturday. He was born in Bavaria. What was funny, as you read, during World War II, his dad was a big anti-Nazi. And his family suffered because of his father's anti-Nazism. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so I'll just read a little here. Ratzinger's family, especially his father, bitterly resented the Nazis, and his father's opposition to Nazism resulted in demotions and harassment of the family. So, but Ratzinger at age 14 was conscripted into the Hitler Youth. Okay, so that was some people had a problem with that. Well, conscripted doesn't mean that someone puts their armor on.
This wasn't a voluntary thing back then.
Oh, you're in. Here's the gun at your head. You're in. Yeah, okay.
Right. Or your family's head. Yeah.
Yeah. And so so he was in the seminary in 1943 when this happened, and they yanked him out. When the war ended, he was interned as a U.S. prisoner of war, and as he was released on June 19th, 1945. The Allies actually used their home as a base of operations once they took over that part of Germany. So he enters into the seminary and graduates from the seminary and becomes a prolific writer. So in 1953, and you have to understand something. There's in the European method, you get your doctor, but if you want to go further, you have to write 2 dissertations. So in 53, he wrote a dissertation on Augustine of Hippo that was titled "The People in the House of God and Augustine's Doctrine of the Church." And then he wrote another, which qualified him for the professorship. You couldn't just write a dissertation to become a professor. You had to write numerous things to become a professor. And he becomes a professor writing on Bonaventure. Bonaventure was a scholastic at the same time as Thomas. But where Thomas went towards the Aristotelians, Bonaventure went to the Platonists. And what we're going to find with Pope Benedict is he's definitely a Neoplatonist and a knowledgeable Neoplatonist. And he's going to be kicking back at Thomistic theology as it has worked within the church and worked within the liturgy. He is definitely not, he doesn't dislike Thomas. He is just not, he thinks that Thomistic theology and the its integration into the liturgy was insufficient and took people away from God. Okay. His big thing was, we need to get back to worship. He's huge on getting back to worship. So he's big on Bonaventure, which then, of course, because of Bonaventure, it gets him into Augustine and it gets him into the early church fathers, which he becomes very conversant with. And so one of the first things I want to read is from his Introduction to Christianity. So the first thing he says in the Introduction to Christianity that writes about how ancient societies worshipped is that they gave something to God to expiate their sin. Think about the Old Testament, that I would have to go to the temple and I give a peace offering, a free will offering, a sin offering, right? A doves, a bull, whatever that is, a lamb, right? And the Joseph Ratzinger writes, in the New Testament, the situation is almost completely reversed. It is not man who goes to God with a compensatory gift, but God who comes to man in order to give to him. And what is God giving to man? Jesus, right? And then the New Testament does not say man conciliates God as we really ought to expect, since after all, it is they who failed, not God. It says on the contrary that in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself. So the first thing he says is, hey, the way this works is you're not, it's God giving you the gifts, okay? Yeah. And then in his Introduction to Christianity, further on, he says, accordingly, in the New Testament, the cross appears primarily as a movement from above to below. It stands there not as a work of expiation that mankind offers to a wrathful God. Okay, so we're see he's already taking a little poke at a certain theology that shall not be named, but as an expression of the foolish love of God that gives itself away to the point of humiliation in order thus to save men, in his approach to us, not the other way about. Now, I want to stop here for a second and bring in Tom Holland, because Tom Holland talks about how awful the cross was seen by early Christians for 300 years. And Pope Benedict sort of references that in his writing, saying the humiliation. There was nothing more humiliating than the crucifixion. Nothing.
It was designed to be humiliating. That
Correct.
The Romans were thinking that what is both painful and humiliating at the same time. That's what crucifixion was designed to do.
Now, the money quote in this area from Pope Benedict: the essential form of Christian worship is therefore rightly called the Eucharista. As Catholics, we call it the Eucharist, Thanksgiving.
The word Eucharist in Greek is from the word "eu," which is good or right, and charis, which is the word for gift or grace. Like if a charismatic Christian, right? That's from the word charis, which is gifting, and so it's a good gift or a good thanks.
Correct. It's excellent. In this form of worship, human achievement is not placed before God. So again, what's he doing? He's saying, on the contrary, it consists in man's letting himself be endowed with gifts. We do not glorify God by supposedly giving to him out of our resources as if they were not his already, but by letting ourselves be endowed with his own gifts and thus recognizing him as the only Lord. So this is a foundation of how it's going to inform his views of the liturgy. That when I go to a mass, I'm not giving anything to God. He's feeding me. He's coming down. He's here. See, I think one of the things that we have where we're having a meaning crisis is that and Paul Vanderklay's worked on this, and even John Vervaeke, we split. God's here, I'm down here, and yeah, there's maybe some spiritual, and Pope Benedict saying nonsense. It's both in the spirit and in the body. It's all integrated together, and it's not just separate.
So I have like a half agreement and a half disagreement, I think, with this idea. Because to me, I mean, Jesus's perfect life and faithfulness unto death by crucifixion is a human achievement. So when Jesus is being offered up, there is a sense that this is a human achievement of a human life perfectly well lived, pleasing to God. But in a certain sense, this is also God giving us his son in a way that we didn't deserve and earn ourselves. And I agree, of course, with, God reconciling the world to himself through Christ. But I feel like Benedict might not be holding both of those things. He seems to be almost overemphasizing the from aboveness and the God-givenness, but not fully acknowledging Jesus's own human achievement.
Well, let's get into that as we go on, because that's and I understand your position based on that Jesus, you're a biblical Unitarian. So it's a criticism received and understood.
In any Christology, you have to have a human there. You can't not have a human Jesus in there, or else you're missing something.
But if you're a Trinitarian like me, you also have a divine Jesus.
Yeah, so don't forget the human part.
Oh, it's very hard to, when you go to church and you have a big cross with Jesus hanging on it. You can if you're paying attention, if you're looking at the floor, then you're right. Now,
although I will say in the notes that you sent me, Ratzinger almost always says God and his son or something like that, and I appreciate that sort of language. That this is the Son of God, and sometimes people are always like, well, this is just God himself. It's like, well, then who's he offering himself to? And so I feel like he does a good job of keeping the role of father and son distinct, and some people are way too blurry about that.
Well, let's stop for a second. He's German, okay, and I'm not saying this teasingly. Germans are very precise, okay. They may be bad at some things, but as coming from a German family, the one thing that Germans have no truck for is imprecision. And one, I think I find Benedict easy to read, but two, he's precise. He doesn't try to. He's going to try to unveil things, not veil them, right? In poor writing, or yes, because it's better to say for the sake of conversation and sake of learning, God and His Son. You can't say God, okay? Because then you get into some real trouble. Now, here's the interesting thing about how Pope Benedict became known, right? So one, he's really influenced by an Italian German named Romano Giordani, who taught at the University of Munich when he was going there, who basically was the first guy to say the Thomistic liturgy of the church writ large is not working. It's taking people away from the worship of God. Okay, and so Benedict never wanted to be a bishop. He wanted to be a professor. He taught at 5 institutions. He was not interested. I think his great line is when he became pope, he felt like the guillotine, that his neck was at the guillotine. Okay, this maybe why he's one of my favorite popes ever is he's the guy who didn't want to be pope. Okay, which means maybe he's the right guy to be pope. So
might also explain why he retired.
Yes. And so Ratzinger Ratzinger becomes very well known by becoming the chief theologian of Cardinal Frings during Vatican II. And most people don't know who Cardinal Frings is, but during Vatican II, he was one of the most senior cardinals. So anytime there was something to get up and speak about, he was one of the first speakers. And he was blind. So Ratzinger's writing everything for him. As a matter of fact, how Frings met Ratzinger is there something for an Italian conclave that they asked Frings to write for. Ratzinger wrote it for him as someone Frings didn't know. Frings read it and just sent it forward.
Yeah.
Didn't even edit it. Just said, here it is.
It's sort of like the relationship between Bishop Alexander and Athanasius. That Athanasius was this young, smart guy who was sort of like the assistant to Bishop Alexander at the Council of Nicaea. And the bishop had the authority and the gravitas, but Athanasius had a lot of the energy and the ideas.
Yeah. So this is where Ratzinger starts challenging during Vatican II the dominant Catholic teaching that was a theology that was somehow contained in small packets of information rather than understanding revelation. He's saying, no, you have to understand revelation, the unveiling of our eyes in seeing God, right? Okay. Ratzinger stated the liturgical movement was in fact an attempt to overcome reductionism, the product of abstract sacramental theology, and to teach us to understand the liturgy as a living network of tradition that has taken concrete form and cannot be torn apart into little pieces, but that has to be seen and experienced as a living whole. That was radical, but it wasn't radical if you read the Church Fathers. It's not radical if you read Augustine. By the way, he does something in his writings. He calls Augustine a mystic. Okay. I've not read enough of Augustine to know if he's a mystic or not, but
he has enough Neoplatonism in him where I suspect that he had. And if you remember, from Augustine's own biography, he really practiced Neoplatonic meditation and sort of mental ascent. Like the Neoplatonists were all about sort of intercontemplation, where you think about God, and by doing that, you ascend in your mind up to the highest realms or something like that. And Augustine used to do that. He said he had some success with it, but not repeated success. And that was part of what led him to look for something more and deeper, and that was Christianity. So I think that Augustine was a mystic. Although it should be noted, I was reading Servetus last night, and he doesn't call Augustine a mystic. He calls him an idiot, which is a slightly different take. But anyway.
Now, here's something that I agree wholeheartedly with Ratzinger. Ratzinger believed that the Sabbath is simply not a remembrance of what has passed, but an active exercise of freedom. The liturgy derives its greatness from not what it is, but what we do with it. Ratzinger goes back to the inception of Christian worship and states. At the beginning, the church operated within the Jewish synagogue. We all forget about that. I love listening to people who don't understand. No. They were worshiping at home. No. The first Christians were worshiping at the temple. Okay? And we're worshiping at home. You're looking at the next iteration when Paul goes out and does, and when the church has its diaspora. But initially, the apostles, as we know them prior to Paul, they were worshiping at the temple. They thought that Jesus was, of course, the logical outworking of the of sacred scripture, what we now call the Old Testament. And so and then what it says, there's a ritual, right? Okay, because when you go to the temple and you're Jewish, and even though you're now a follower of Christ, you follow the ritual. And Pope Benedict says something that probably going to get some people at least thinking quizzically. She joined the celebration of the Eucharist, the basic structure which is equally Jewish, namely the great prayer of thanksgiving. At the core of this thanksgiving, she placed the account of this institution of the Eucharist. Okay, so he's basically saying the Eucharist goes all the way back to, and his argument is that Catholicism is an outworking of Judaism.
And this is an interesting thing for him to say, of course, growing up in Nazi Germany, being forced to attend the Hitler Youth, for him to be connecting the liturgy and the origins of Christian worship to Judaism and doing so proudly in the context of the Holocaust and Catholicism sort of re-examining its relationship to Judaism. For him to say things like that, it's very interesting for those sorts of reasons too.
Well, I think he grew up in a family that was strongly Catholic and strongly anti-Nazi.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, the Catholic Church had some pretty anti-Jewish stances for a pretty long time. And some of the anti-Semitism in Germany was recognizably Christian, not just this new Hitler thing. And
Luther.
so for
Luther.
It wasn't just the Lutherans. Luther didn't make it up either. The Catholics had a pretty downward look on Judaism as being basically a religion cursed by God. And we've seen that even in some of the early church fathers, and Constantine said things like that as well. So to be affirming the Jewishness of Christian liturgy is pretty radical for those sorts of reasons.
Yes. And so now, so here's something. So I'm going to quote a friend of mine. A friend of mine he sent his kids to a Christian grammar school in Wheaton. And he is a strong high church Anglican. So when we used to worship together, he would prostrate himself during Good Friday on the cross for about a half an hour. And so he said he was at picking up his kids, and one of the parents said, I went to a Catholic wedding, and they had this big cross. It was so awful. Okay. And Charlie said to her, isn't that the center of our worship? Okay. And here's Pope. I use this story because Pope Benedict comes in and says the cross stands at the center of the Christian liturgy. With all its seriousness, a banal optimism that banishes suffering and injustice from the world with mere talk and reduces being a Christian to niceness has nothing to do with the liturgy of the cross. This is a shot across the bow that he's taking 50, 60 years ago to a Christianity.
Against nice Christianity. Yeah.
Now you're saying, no, that's nonsense. Okay.
Yeah.
The redemption cost God the suffering and death of his Son. In the exterium, that is the practice of the exercise of redemption, which is what the liturgy is, according to the conciliar document, cannot take place without purification, maturation involved in following the way of the cross. Okay? That, when I went to whether it's Willow Creek or other evangelical churches, you just had this empty cross that was sort of a symbol. There was nothing. The only time you talked about the centrality of the cross was Good Friday.
Or the altar call.
Right. But that was it.
Mm-hmm.
And what Pope Benedict is saying, no, is you go to Mass, every time you go to Mass and you're doing the liturgy, that cross is right at the center. It's because it's a reminder. Because we keep on forgetting. Judges is a great book about Israel keeping on forgetting God's promises. And we as Christians also forget God's promises all the time, okay? Because we get caught up in other nonsense. So then he says, to the liturgy belongs both speech and silence, singing in the praise of instruments, the visual image, the symbol, and the gesture that corresponds to the word. I put something on Facebook yesterday about how art was used by the Catholic Church before people were literate as a way of evangelization. I can't even talk.
Evangelization.
Thank you very much. It was, and Pope Benedict points that what we've seen in art is because we've pointed away to God and to ourselves. Art has gotten worse and worse and worse, right? To the point now that modern art is a joke. Who is it? Alex O'Connor basically saying, why is the art of people who believe in God so much better than the art of people who don't believe in God? Mm-hmm. Okay, because a good artist who believes in God is pointing away from him or herself to something higher, instead of looking at us, which there's not much there to look at times. Okay, now here's something else that for some of my friends who think, he also points out the Pope is not the absolute monarch whose will is law. Rather, he's a guardian of the authentic tradition and thereby the premier guardian of obedience. He cannot do as he likes. He is thereby able to oppose those people who, for their part, want to do whatever comes into their head. His rule is not that of arbitrary power, but that of the obedience of faith. And that's why
you think other popes should read that statement.
I have no comment. Yeah. I'm going to be studiously silent on that issue. Yeah. But all I'll have to say is nicely said. Okay. Here's something else. The Christian liturgy has its origin in the cenacle, the upper room of the Last Supper, in which the paschal mystery of death and resurrection was anticipated and opened up for cultic representation. So, as a Catholic Christian, we believe that the taking of the Eucharist is a representation of Christ's death, that we're participating. And one of my friends I go to Catholic, our church with, Mark, who was Jewish, who became a Catholic Christian, would say, yes, that's the reason he became a Catholic Christian was the Passover was a representation. They understood. He understood. He said, this is the only understandable faith for me as a Christian. And so the Pope Benedict says, our liturgy starts at the Last Supper. And he says, what is it, the liturgy? It cannot consist in the church finally subjecting herself to modern culture, which has been caught up to a large extent in the process of self-doubt since it's lost its religious faith. Now, Bishop Barron points out that the 70s and 80s were the Catholic clown show, okay, where you had this liturgy becoming part of the modern culture. We're going to have guitars, we're going to have all this stuff, and We're going to sing, "They'll know we are Christians by our love." And
Not a bad song. Not a bad song.
Horrible song. And what happened, and part of why Willow Creek grew so large, was Catholic Christians left the church and said, "We got to find something. We got it. This is not working. It's horrible." Okay.
When I was at a Willow Creek-like church in Madison, Wisconsin, I would say between a quarter and a third of the people there were former Catholics.
Yep. Then Pope Benedict starts, talking about how the early church fathers viewed the Eucharist. For the church fathers, too, from the earliest witnesses onward, just think of St. Justin Martyr, who we've done, or St. Ignatius of Antioch. There was no doubt about the great mystery of the presence bestowed upon us and the change of the gifts during the Eucharistic prayer. Even a theologian of such spiritualizing tendency as St. Augustine never had a doubt about it. Okay? Now, this is where you start, so for really, I believe 1,200 years, there was a unanimity, even though the church had a schism, about the Eucharist. Okay? There was no divergence about what the Eucharist was. Then we come into St. Thomas. And St. Thomas writes about the Eucharist, but he's writing it as a scholastic and an Aristotelian. And he really didn't disagree with it, but he brought in Aristotelianism, and what happened was Occam came forward. And Occam took St. Thomas's Aristotelianism and split it. He said, God's up here, spiritual. We're down here, physical. And so what happened was the accidents of the Eucharist became this sort of like, how does Christ become present in the Eucharist physically? And everybody started thinking about that. And obviously, Pope Benedict is not a big fan of Occam. He thinks Occam created a lot of headaches for the church. And I think those headaches found themselves very prevalent in the Reformation. Mm-hmm. Because what happened was, his point is that especially Calvin split and put God with Occam way up here, way far away, and put us way down here.
Although later on, when Benedict talks about Calvin's Eucharistic theology, he admits that Calvin, and this is similar to Brett Salkeld. This is similar to what Brett Salkeld says, that in many ways, a lot of the reformers, including Calvin and Luther, noticed that something was weird about the way that Catholics were talking about the Eucharist, and that it was this quasi-physical transformation. And they were trying to get back to a more spiritual understanding of it. And we also forget that at the time of the Reformation, regular Catholic folks only took the Eucharist maybe once a year. And even then, they only took the bread and not the wine. And only the clergy would regularly participate in the Eucharist. And that the Protestant reformers were often way more emphasizing that everyday regular people should be taking it once a week, and to trying to correct some of the confusion that Aquinas, through the lenses of Occam and other later developments, got confused in. Right. And so I think that sometimes we're like, Catholics like Eucharist and liturgy and the Protestants didn't. But in that early phase, it was actually kind of the opposite.
And the Council changed that, but then what happened is the Baptists came in. And that became a whole, we could talk about that a little, but what's interesting about, this is something that I would we have to, this is I think a very salient idea by Pope Benedict. Man cannot simply make worship. If God does not reveal himself, man is clutching at empty space. And sometimes, so I was talking to a friend of mine when we went to a church in Wheaton, what they did is they created 2 services concurrently together, traditional and contemporary. And it was funny, everybody over 50, they got surprised. There were more people at the traditional service than they were at the contemporary service. And at times I will think that the music was man making up worship. And people not worshiping, saying this is not worship. Something's wrong here. It's a lot of loud music up to 11, and then there's a message. And why did I come? I could just go on YouTube and see a good Alistair Beggs or Rick Warren video, right? Okay. And the point that Pope Benedict's making is that God has to reveal himself. We go to church to worship. Is God revealing himself when we go to church? Do we actually believe it? Or if we don't, you know what? Hey, it's Super Bowl Sunday. I'm going to watch all the 10 hours before the game. Okay? So he also says that theology and liturgy in a special way is a symbolic theology. It's a theology of symbols which connect us to what is present but hidden. On a personal side, my daughter became a Catholic Christian through those symbols. Those symbols had a powerful impact on her that made her explore the Catholic faith. And I think that one of the things that we've done in our society is try to disintermediate symbols, and yet we just create new symbols, whether it's the pride flag, whether it's other symbols, right? Man has to live with symbols. Jonathan Pageau has been very eye-opening on how symbolic we really are. And so the question really is, are we having efficacious symbols or symbols that deteriorate us as men and women made in the image of God? And I would say that it's better to have efficacious symbols, symbols that point us to God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. He also believes that worship is a fundamental act that affects the whole man. That's why bending a knee is so important. It's the whole person. Why do I, when I first get to church and do the genuflection, I also bend my knee. That's an act of submission. Okay, it's an act of worship. When I bend my knee, something is greater than I am. Okay, I am making an assent that Christ on the cross is greater than I am. I'm bending my knee to that essential fact. And I love this. Christian liturgy is liturgy on the way, a liturgy of pilgrimage toward the here you go, Sam, towards the transfiguration of the world, which will only take place when God is all in all.
Amen. Sounds good to me.
You like that?
I do like that. Sounds pretty good.
Another
thing that I liked, even though this has the word incarnation, you skipped over this quote, but I actually like this quote. The incarnation is aimed at man's transformation through the cross and to the new corporeality of the resurrection. God seeks us where we are, not so that we stay there. The goal is the transformation of our bodies through the resurrection that was accomplished on the cross. Right. I'm like, I can agree with that. That sounds pretty good to me. And I also like the quote that, it's right after the one that you just read. In the Eucharist, a communion takes place that corresponds to the union of man and women in marriage. Just as they become one flesh, so in communion, we all become one spirit, one person with Christ. The spousal mystery announced in the Old Testament and the intimate union of God and man takes place in the sacrament of the body and blood of Christ, precisely through his passion. That's sort of some mystical symbology for you, but I thought that was pretty good too.
Yeah. it's I would say to anybody who's going to watch this, read a lot of Ratzinger. In my mind, he's the greatest theologian of the 20th century because he's really addressing a lot of issues that we're starting to really wrestle with now. And he was wrestling with them 50, 60 years ago. Here's something else. This my daughter didn't like this quote because my daughter is a Trinidine Catholic. Well, here again, we know that until the 9th century, communion was received in the hand standing. His point that he's making is that church tradition does change, but
and so the opposite of that would be place on your mouth while kneeling.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. And so my Trinidine friends say that's the only way that you could take the Eucharist. And Pope Benedict saying, well, not really. The early church took it by the hand.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously in reverence. When you take it by your hand, you go like this and you bow, right? And by the way, the priest doesn't let you leave until the Eucharist is in your mouth and you said one word. Amen. You're not going anywhere until that happens, okay? Now, one of the other things I found interesting, obviously he's read a lot of, Augustine says in one place, in a sermon to his new communicants, no one can receive the communion without first adoring. So what the Catholic Church has really done is what's called the Eucharistic revival for the last few years, which is the adoration of the Eucharist. Now, for a lot of people, they would find that strange, but here's where I think, I think a Muslim said this, if you really believe that Christ is in that, you would be dressed properly and you would act properly, right? Okay? And part of that proper acting is adoration. That's the ultimate sacrifice right there. It's Christ's body. Okay? And so there's that adoration. Here's the other thing. The goal of the Eucharist is the transformation of those who receive it in authentic communion with Christ's transformation. And so the goal is unity, that we, instead of being separated individuals who live alongside or in conflict with one another, might become with Christ in him one organism of self-giving and might live unto the resurrection and the new world.
That sounds great. I would ask, what does he mean by Christ's transformation there?
You'll have to ask him.
Right. So, for me,
he's not around right now.
So for me, this would make perfect sense in terms of Jesus being transformed. Jesus becomes a life-giving spirit, as it says in 1 Corinthians 15. For me, like the theosis of Jesus, where Jesus transforms from a man into a fully divinized, eternal, life-giving spirit man. And that we participate in that transformation by participating in the Eucharist, looking forward to the day when that transformation will be complete in us, and that we are all one living body of Christ, one organism together, living into the resurrection and the new world. Well, that sounds great. I like how his theology is not just focused on going to heaven when you die, but focused on the resurrection and the new creation. I feel like that's something that Catholics often miss. But I find it encouraging to see this in Benedict. Although I'm not going to just pick on Catholics. Evangelicals seem to miss that just as much as the Catholics, for the record.
Well, that's why I really appreciate Pope Benedict's writings on this, because it really, as Jacques Ellul once said, it gets us back into it's the here and now. You can't just be... It's got to be.
That's a deep Trek quote, quoting Ellul. Yeah, you're showing off there a little bit, Hank.
Well, the old dog has a few tricks, my friend. I just don't troll Paul Vanderklay, okay? Although he is easy to troll.
All right, tell me about music, Hank. I know that music is something near and dear to your heart.
Right.
For those who don't know, Hank comes from a family of wonderful musicians and is a great musician himself.
Yes. Well, I love these quotes because, man, he said it better than I ever could. Pop music is a manufactured and industrial mass production like technical goods in a totally inhuman and dictatorial system. Okay? Amen.
Tell me what you really think.
Well,
so he was not a fan of Taylor Swift.
Right. Mass culture is thus geared to quantity, production, and success. It is a culture of the measurable and marketable. Pop music joins up with that culture, saying, no, we can't have that. Okay? You and I have a friend who goes to church up in the North Shore, who refuses to go until the sermon starts because he calls modern Christian music awful, right? He just says it's awful. He went to my daughter's baptism and wrote on Facebook, he goes, I don't understand the Catholic Church, but at least it doesn't have that awful praise music, okay? If you're going to church and you think that music is awful, something's wrong, either with you or with the church, okay? Well, the church that I went to in Wheaton proved that maybe the problem is with the music. If more than half the people on a Sunday overcrowd into a chapel rather than at the big theater, right, that the church had, maybe you should be asking yourself a question. Is the music that we're putting on the right type of music? Is it really praiseworthy? If people, basically the crowd says, we're over here. I want to listen to the old hymns, okay? And I think Pope Benedict saw this quite a while, 50 years ago, that the pop music infestating the services actually, I think, detracts from worship. It doesn't enhance worship. And I'll speak as somebody who played at Willow Creek, and we played the pop music, okay? It's bounded in time. If you listen to most pop music of a certain generation, it's not long lasting. Okay, it's bounded in that time. Whereas if you listen to Mozart or great jazz, it transforms you and it's timeless. Good music should actually make you look outside yourself to other things. Good Christian music should make you look to the Lord. So, and he brings up that this was the fascination that the early church had with Greek music, and the early church had to say, no, you can't have this. He points out that this Greek music helped create Gnosticism. Okay. So he comes up in the sense that taking up of music into the liturgy must be its taking up into the spirit, a transformation that implies both death and resurrection. That is why the church has to be critical of all ethnic music. It cannot be allowed untransformed into the sanctuary. Now,
Is Mozart ethnic music? Is Bach ethnic music? Is there a little bit of German snobbery in this? I can't help but wonder. Although if any race was allowed to be snobbish about their musical accomplishments, I suppose it would be the Germans.
I had a friend of mine who's an atheist he's a agnostic, said he only believes in God because only God could have created Mozart. Okay.
Because I think that in America, it's interesting, there's the old hymns and then there's the new contemporary music, but we forget about African-American spiritual music and gospel music. And that's one of those things where it is a very different style than hymns and classical music, but it has an authenticity and a lastingness to it that I think transcends its context. But every music has a context. And so I think that, anyway, that wasn't my favorite quote of the episode, but I'll let you continue.
It's mine. That's why, again, Sam and I are showing how we could disagree friendly. Okay. Now, in art, one of the things that I like to point out on Facebook is I like to put pictures of Catholic churches. And Catholic churches look completely different than Protestant churches, right? So here's Pope Benedict. The beauty of the cathedral does not stand in opposition to the theology of the cross, but its fruit. It was born from the willingness not to build one city by oneself and for oneself. The misuse of something just for oneself is, of course, not excluded by this. No church building possesses the promise of eternity. None is irreplaceable. Each one can be taken from us when the power justifying it crumbles. So he's not, but the idea that churches were built because it held the mystery. It was also, the churches did so much, especially in the Gothic period, that I think modern man doesn't understand. It was for worship, but it was also for teaching. And what I mean by teaching is the art was the teacher. We have a presentism saying, well, we all can read, it's sola scriptura. Well, that's great if you can read, but most people 800, 900, 1,000 years ago were illiterate. It was the invention of the printing press that created the acceleration of literacy. So how do you teach people who can't read about the promises and the love and the beauty of the Christian faith? Through art. Why do people still go to Gothic cathedrals today, whether they're Christians or non-Christians, and are just awe-inspired by the art, by the stained glass windows, by the beauty? Why does Alice O'Connor say, how come we can't build things like this? The reason you can't build things like this is because you're worshiping something else.
And it takes intergenerational faithfulness to a project to build something like a cathedral. And what sort of thing can foster intergenerational faithfulness?
Right, which is why when we speak of people creating their own religions, very rarely is there intergenerational faithfulness. There's just really... Right. Now, the other thing is...
Yeah, so let's move on to your most favorite subject, and that is the errors of John Calvin.
So here's I think maybe something we could contend with our friend Tripp. We have characterized Calvin's understanding as a theology of the ascension, okay, which, however, in spite of several attempts along these lines, lacks the necessary dialectical reinforcement with incarnational theology, so that Christianity has no more here, but is referred completely to the there, namely to the heaven, to the afterlife. Okay, I think that's
right about that.
That's a great insight. Okay, I think, and he's not mean to Calvin. If you read him, he's not like, but he what he does, he actually read the Institutes of the Christian Theology and Calvinism, and takes him seriously, and then seriously says, here's some, much like Servetus tried to take Calvin seriously. It's funny. I wish Calvinists would take Calvin seriously. I think Tripp does, but I think a lot of Calvinists have become something that I don't think even Calvin would understand.
But yeah, that it's so focused on going up to heaven when you die, because the down here is just bad and icky.
Correct.
And
I would tell you that I believe Calvin is not addressing Augustine or the Catholic Church. He's addressing Occam.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Remember, we'll have another quote. It's Calvin endeavored to restore Augustine's Eucharistic teaching as faithfully as possible. So I want to give props to people who really understand Calvin. Of course, upon closer inspection, his attempt shows that there is no such thing as simple renewal of the past. One cannot do 1,000 years of history. There's no going back from the formulation of questions once they've been broached. And he's really saying there's three guys who broached the questions that Calvin was trying to contend with, and they weren't Augustine. They were Duns Scotus, Berengarius, and Occam. And the church had some real problems with those three characters. Okay, and I think that we are always people of our time. So the questions that Calvin was going after, Augustine didn't even contemplate. They weren't there. They weren't something that he would even think about. Okay, so then, moreover, the word transubstantiation recalls the self-alienation of Eucharistic doctrine that was largely dominant well into our century. The emphasis in teaching about the sacrament shifted from active association with the risen Lord who grants us fellowship with himself to a static ontological perspective that mentality, strongly tinged with monophysitism, skips over the humanity of Jesus Christ. So here, hold on, Sam, he's with you, isn't he? He's saying you can't skip over the humanity of Jesus Christ. It simply considers the host as the locus of God's presence, as God's earthly throne before which one adores, while almost forgetting the invitation to table fellowship, contrary to the original reason for the institution of the sacrament. So he's going back to the initial Cenacle, where Jesus has table fellowship with the apostles.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying that's what Jesus is calling to us now, table fellowship. Yes, there's adoration, but there's also the table fellowship, the community, the being together, that Christ is here. He's just not up there. You know, here's a question I have that you cannot. The idea that, okay, there was the New Testament was written and everything's done, and we're just waiting for the rapture. That's not how God works. God is active today. Okay, it's not like, well, you know, there's this Bible. We go to church. We learn the teachings of the New Testament. Yeah, maybe some of the Old Testament, but the Old Testament's icky. That's a nasty God. He's not the nice one that Jesus is. And I think Pope Benedict sort of calls out both the Protestant church, but he's calling out the Catholic Church. He's calling out the Thomists, saying you've disintermediated God too far. We need to bring him back. That was the liturgical tradition that he was bringing back, and that you're starting to see coming into the church, even through Pope Francis. Okay, I think the Catholic Church has really changed, and it's funny in our Bible study, much of them with older Catholics, they say we were never taught this when we were growing up. It's been the last 10 years they've been taught this. That is the final outworking of all the years that Benedict was laboring in the field. That it's now become a living part of the Catholic Church for the Mass, and I think it's wonderful.
And this would be one of my critiques of perhaps an overemphasis on liturgy and that sort of thing, is that it has a tendency to devolve into a dry proceduralism, where people are so focused on the motions and what just going through the motions is able to accomplish, that it forgets to add this teaching part too. And it's like, well, as long as people are doing the right thing, then that's enough, really. What more do you need for the regular person than that they're going through the motions and doing the right thing? And that if you don't have this connection to the mind and the teaching and the understanding of what's happening, that it doesn't have its proper effect. And I think that's why a lot of Catholics left the faith in the late 20th century.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that why you're seeing, it's funny, what you're seeing is the current crop of Catholics coming up. A lot of them have come from Calvinism, okay, and have actually interacted with Ratzinger. They all have one thing in common. They seem to really love Ratzinger. Okay, and they've had a great, profound effect within. Now, that view of the Eucharist is already a big in the African church. Okay, and you're seeing it taking hold in the American church, and I think it's going to have a profound effect. And I would contend, regardless, the problem with Western Christianity writ large, whether it's Catholic, Orthodox, is the lack of catechism, the lack of teaching, the the lack of why are we doing stuff. It's not sort of like have you had your kids watch Babe the Pig?
No.
Watch it. It's a great movie. But there's a cow that says the way things are the way things are. When asked why are we, the pig would say, why are we doing this? Well, the way things are the way things are. When your teaching is the way things are the way things are, do not be surprised when people start leaving the faith.
Mm-hmm.
Do not be surprised when people walk away. You have to explain to them, sometimes in granular detail to some people, exactly why we're doing what we're doing. Peter told us to have an answer, right? You got it. I will tell you that if I go to our church in Wheaton, St. Michael's, I can just go through the motions. No. Mm-hmm. Say the liturgy, say the creeds, take the Eucharist, call it a day. But if my heart and my mind has been transformed by Christ, then the liturgy has such a profound effect. Now, that profound effect should not only be the effect right there and now, but the profound effect should be ongoing. So, and I think Pope Benedict gives us a really good insight, but what he's doing is he's really connecting us back to the early church and the church fathers. He's trying to connect us to a deeper tradition that was lost, I believe, when scholasticism hit. So that's my review of Pope Benedict and the liturgy.
Well, I thought that was very interesting. I like what Benedict says that liturgy properly done is embodied theology, and that it's getting your body and your soul active in the practice of theology, and that it's getting your mind not just to be thinking but doing, and that these things all complement each other, that there is a bridge between the liturgy and your theology and your teachings, and that it is symbolically representative of the work and accomplishments of what God did through Christ. I think that's a very profound thing. I like his emphasis on resurrection in the new world. I would be curious what he meant by the transformation of Christ, because as far as I understand, you can't have too heavy of an emphasis on the incarnation and believe that Jesus gets transformed into something more glorious later. But so I found that all very encouraging.
Well, it's one of these days. There's a guy that I'm trying to get a conversation with who is a theologian with the Word on Fire, who's a Benedict expert. He's wrote his dissertations on Benedict. He would be a very interesting person to have a conversation with.
Well, get him on and we'll talk to him.
Sounds like a plan. I appreciate you allowing me to do a little chit-chatting.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Hank. Happy to learn from what you've been learning about. So thanks for doing this.
Yeah. By the way, what's the next church father that
we need to do? Basil the Great is who we're on, and I've been dragging my feet on that. But yeah, we need to dig into Basil the Great. Maybe one of his best books is On the Holy Spirit. So,
yeah. Well, while we do that in March, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be in Florida because there's nothing worse than being in Illinois in February.
Oh man, today is not a great day to be in Illinois. The weather is just icky.
Yeah. I'm, God has called Kate and Hank to Florida for as long as we could possibly stand it, which could be for a long time.
Okay, well, I'm jealous. I'm going to Florida in March, but
good. Hey, anytime you can leave Illinois. The problem is that you come back to Illinois.
Yeah. Well, So Illinois has a great summer and fall. I feel like
Yes.
we're good at that. Although this summer is going to be the year of the cicadas. Did you hear about this? That for the first time since like the early 1800s, the 13-year cicada, which comes out every 13 years, is coming out this year. There's also a 17-year cicada, which is also coming out this year, in addition to just the regular amount of cicadas, which is a lot. And the only place in the United States where the 13-year cicada overlaps with the 17-year cicada, guess where that is, Hank?
Illinois.
Northern Illinois, especially Chicagoland. We're like the only place in the world that gets a double whammy of cicadas this year.
Thanks for making my day, Sam. Looks like I'll be sitting in North Carolina in the
Florida
summer.
a little longer. Yeah. All right.
Yep. Yeah, I might have to stay longer.
All right. Thanks, Hank. Thanks everyone else for listening.